Oftentimes, cartridges arrive the way they were meant to, boxed, labeled, sealed in their proper package. And then there are the ones that come to you second-hand, loose in a shoebox, sun-warmed on a folding table, priced low enough that nobody asks where they've been. Those are the ones I pay attention to the most, because when a game changes hands, it doesn't just pick up fingerprints, it picks up habits, little rituals. The way someone used to pause before making a choice, the way they kept track of what mattered, the places they returned to. Sometimes you can feel that history before you even plug it in. In 1993, a middle school girl found a Sega Genesis cartridge called Starflight at a yard sale for $5. No box, no maps, no inserts, just the cart and a label worn thin from being handled too many times. Starflight isn't the kind of game that wants to entertain you quickly. It doesn't guide you by the hand. It gives you a ship, a galaxy, and a long silence. Then it waits to see what you do with it. It asks for something most games don't. It asks you to remember. So she did what the game rewarded. She took notes, real ones, pencil on paper, coordinates, shorthand, little squares shaded in when something seemed important. Her notebook became part of the controller, an extra button the game never told her about. To her parents, it looked like a phase, a quiet hobby, a kid disappearing into the living room after school with a spiral notebook and a mechanical pencil. Serious in the way only kids can be serious about a thing they love. To her, it felt like competence, like control, like a universe that wasn't going to bend itself into something easy just because she was young. That is the part I pay attention to. Not the obvious hauntings, not the crude ones, the quieter pattern. A game asks for attention. A player gives it. And somewhere along the way, the ordinary ritual around the game begins to matter as much as the game itself. The notebook, the shorthand, the habit of checking, then checking again. So she met it on its own terms. What follows is her account of what happened after a $5 cartridge made note-taking feel less like a hobby and more like orientation. And if you find yourself reaching for a pen while you listen, pay attention to what you're afraid you might lose. This is Claire's story. I call it
I found Starflight in a cardboard box under a folding table, wedged between a busted VCR and a stack of VHS tapes that smelled like dust and cardboard. It was May of '93, one of those Saturdays where the air already had summer in it, and the sun made everything look a little washed out. Our neighbors 2 doors down were having a yard sale because they were moving to Florida for his job, which I only understood as no more free popsicles in July. The cartridge was loose. No box, no plastic case, no thick manual with maps and warnings. Just the black Genesis card with a scuffed label. A tiny ship angled toward a blue planet. Starflight, printed in block letters, half scratched off, like someone had worried at it with a thumbnail. There was a price written right on the plastic in silver Sharpie. $5. I picked it up and turned it over in my hands. It had that particular weight of Genesis cartridges. Solid, a little blunt. The ridges on the sides were warm from sitting in the sun. Dad stood behind me, half pretending to look at a rack of old shirts, half watching me do that kid math where you count your allowance in your head and decide what you can live without. "Another Sonic?" he asked. "Or one of those sports games where you lose to a computer for fun?" "I don't know," I said. "It looks like a space game." He made a face like he was weighing the educational value of space. Mom's voice drifted from down the sidewalk. She was at a different table, asking a woman about a lamp. "Claire, don't wander. Cars." "I'm here," I called back, as she began walking home before me and Dad. Dad lowered his voice. "So, how much?" "5, I replied. He whistled softly, then shrugged. $5 buys a lot of space. He said it like a joke, but he was smiling the way he did when he was about to say yes. "Tell you what," he added. "You help carry the boxes home, and I'll spot you." I tried not to smile too hard. "Deal." We walked home with other people's junk. A lamp, a box of mismatched mugs, the cartridge tucked into my hoodie pocket, like it might try to get away. Mom was already in the kitchen when we got back, standing over the stove with the fan on too high. The whole room smelled like onions and dish soap. "What did you find?" she asked without turning around. "Space for $5, Dad said, holding up the cartridge like it was a trophy. Mom glanced over her shoulder. $5 of space? "Educational space," he said, then winked at me. She smiled, faint. "As long as it doesn't involve aliens teaching her to skip homework." "That would be a steal for only $5, I said jokingly. "Then keep your grades up," she replied, and turned back to the stove. Dad gave me a little conspiratorial nod like we'd just signed something official. Our Genesis sat under the TV, a slightly yellowed Model 1 with the headphone jack on the front and the volume slider stuck halfway. The living room had that constant background hum you don't notice until you're listening for it. Fridge in the kitchen, traffic outside, the faint buzz of the CRT when it warmed up. I pushed the cartridge in until it clicked, turned the power on. A star field filled the screen, blocky text. A simple title track that tried very hard to sound like the future with the tools it had. Then menus, not the friendly kind. No cartoon tutorial character, no bright arrow saying, "Press start" in a looping dance. Just lists and windows and little status bars that sat there, patient and indifferent, waiting for me to figure out what they meant. Crew files, ship status, cargo, navigation. I stared at it for a full minute without moving. Dad passed through the room carrying laundry. He paused behind the couch and watched the screen over my head. "You figure it out?" he asked. "Working on it," I said, like I was an adult doing taxes. He nodded like I'd said something impressive. "Well, Captain," he murmured, "the galaxy's not gonna map itself." Then he kept walking. That line lodged in me the way certain silly things do. Captain, galaxy, map. Because it was true. That night, I cleaned the living room coffee table, lined up my notebooks, and found my best mechanical pencil. The one with the blue grip and the little twist-out eraser. Within a week, my science notebook wasn't a science notebook anymore. It was a star chart with a few worksheets trapped inside. Starflight asked you to keep notes. It didn't say it in a cute way. It just made it obvious. You jump to a system, you scan a planet, you find something you want to come back to, and if you don't write it down, good luck. The game didn't care if you lost your place. It didn't care if you forgot. It simply kept going. I loved that. I loved the idea that the universe didn't rearrange itself around me. That if I wanted to exploit a route, run fuel from one system to another, haul minerals, sell high, buy low, I had to build it myself. I had to pay attention. I had to remember. And when I couldn't trust my memory, I had paper. After school, I'd drop my backpack in my room, eat something quick at the counter, and then disappear into the living room with the notebook open on the carpet beside me. I wrote down star coordinates. I drew tiny grids. I invented shorthand. The game's coordinates were numbers, but numbers alone felt too slippery. So I started giving important squares my own labels. T9, K4. Little names for places the screen only treated as data. F for fuel, M for minerals. Double exclamation marks for weird. I kept a separate corner for alien encounters as well. Who answered friendly? Who needed flattery? Who fired before I finished hailing them? A little skull if the gravity reading looked high enough to turn planetfall into scrap metal. A star if I found ruins or a signal that didn't sound like static. The living room became my cockpit. The light from the TV washed everything in blue-white. The controller got warm in my hands. The pencil made that soft scratch on the paper that felt like progress. It wasn't only the game, it was the ritual. At school, while Mrs. Warren wrote about the water cycle on the board, I filled margins with coordinates and tiny boxes. The chalk squeaked. Fluorescent lights hummed. Somewhere behind my eyes, a galaxy expanded. Mom noticed the notebook the first time it appeared on the dinner table. She had a wooden spoon in one hand, and that way of reading while still half doing something else, eyes moving faster than the rest of her. "What's all that?" she asked, lifting the page corner with the back of one finger so she wouldn't get sauce on it. "Just notes," I said. "For what?" she asked. "A game." She blinked at me like I'd said I was taking notes for chewing gum. "Okay, just don't let it take over your real homework." "I won't," I said, and meant it. Dad didn't touch the notebook. He just glanced at it sometimes when he passed, the way you glance at a map on a wall. "Looks official," he'd say, and I'd feel my shoulders square a little, like I was doing something that counted. The first time I made a big discovery, something that felt like more than minerals and money, I sat up straighter. It was a strange signal on a planet I'd only stopped at because it had decent fuel. The scanner returned something that wasn't just numbers, a pattern, a reason to land. Down on the surface, after too many careful moves in the terrain vehicle, I found ruins and a piece of alien information I couldn't decode yet. I circled the coordinates twice, underlined them, wrote "Come back" in block letters so heavy the pencil tip tore the paper. The galaxy, for the first time, felt like it belonged to me. Then, it didn't. The first void didn't look like anything dramatic. That was what made it worse. I went back to that system a day later, eager like I'd left a present for myself and couldn't wait to open it again. The nav screen showed the galaxy grid. Stars scattered like thumbtacks. My cursor moved from square to square. Every time it passed over a star, there was a soft synthetic chirp. Confirmation. Data. A little yes. When I moved the cursor to the coordinates I'd circled twice, the chirp didn't happen. There was a click. Flat. Small. Like a cassette tape mechanism stopping. And the square was empty. No star, no label, no planets to scan. Just the grid-line box, the cursor sliding over it like it was skimming across a dead pixel. I stared at the screen, then at my notebook. The coordinates were right there, neat in my own handwriting. I could see my underlines, my blocky "come back." But the writing looked faint. Not gone exactly, just lighter, as if it had been rubbed with a thumb that wasn't mine. I touched the page with my fingertip. The pencil wasn't smudged. There weren't eraser crumbs. I flipped the page back and forth like that could make the universe pop back in. "Maybe I wrote it wrong," I said out loud, even though I could see I hadn't. I tested nearby systems. Those were fine. Stars loaded, chirps sounded, planets spun, ugly and beautiful in their little pixelated ways. The empty square stayed empty. So I did what a kid does when something weird happens. I made a smaller weird thing I could control. In the margin next to those coordinates, I drew a tiny box. I shaded it in with the side of my pencil until it was a dark smudge, a place where something should be. I told myself it was a glitch, dirty contacts, an unlucky bit of code, the kind of thing kids complain about on playgrounds and adults shrug off. I cleaned the cartridge with a cotton swab and rubbing alcohol like I'd seen my cousin do with NES games. I blew on it once, out of habit, even though everyone said not to. The next time I turned the game on, the system I'd labeled T9 in my notebook was still blank. The first real-life blank was smaller. Dad called from the living room. "Hey, can you grab my keys? I left them on the..." On the what? The word simply wasn't there. I could picture the shape of the thing. Small table, narrow, by the door, where we tossed mail and a bowl of coins. But the label failed to show up. Mom answered from the sink without even looking. "Table, the hall table." "Right," I said too quickly. Dad appeared in the doorway a second later, watching me. His face didn't change much, but his eyes held on mine a fraction longer than they needed to. "You okay?" he asked. "Just blanked," I said. I tried to smile like it was funny. Like when you can't remember what the whisk is called and you say, "egg stick." Mom laughed a little, still rinsing a plate. Everyone blanks sometimes. I called the dishwasher the washing machine yesterday. She said things like that the way she folded receipts into jars or wrote appointment times on envelopes. If the world could be named neatly enough, it usually behaved. Dad didn't laugh. He picked up his keys and turned them in his hand, like he was thinking about weight. That night, after I played, I opened my notebook to the page with the shaded void box. The box was still there, but when I tilted the page toward the desk lamp, I saw faint pressure marks beneath my writing, grooves in the paper where my pencil had once been, like I'd written something and erased it hard enough to scrape the graphite away, but not hard enough to flatten the fibers. I didn't remember erasing anything. I traced the indent with my thumb. The letters were there, barely, without color. The shape of my own handwriting. A fossil. I rubbed my fingertips together afterward. No eraser dust, no graphite smudge. Just the sensation of paper that had been pressed too hard, as if the act of writing had become more important than what was written. After that, I started testing things. Not in a dramatic way. In the quiet way kids test anything adults would tell them not to make a project out of. I wrote the same fact twice in different places. Once in the science notebook, once on a loose sheet folded into my pocket. Our address, Dad's full name, Mrs. Warren's first name. The loose sheet stayed normal. The notebook page didn't. So then I tried writing things that didn't matter. State capitals, multiplication facts, the lunch menu. Those mostly stayed. The details I cared about were the ones that faded first. I didn't tell anybody I was doing this. It made too much sense inside my own head. The game wanted me to keep records. Fine. I would keep records about the keeping of records. Over the next couple of weeks, the game's voids multiplied. It wasn't constant. It wasn't predictable. That would have been easier in a way. Instead, it was the slow, creeping realization that the galaxy didn't behave the same way twice. A planet I'd marked as rich minerals loaded as a featureless black sphere with no readable stats. A crew file briefly opened with the name field blank, like the game remembered the job, but not the person. A sector of the star map lost its background stars until I flew close, as if the universe refused to draw itself in until I forced it. At first, I explained it to myself in the same careful way adults explain away odd sounds in old houses. The cartridge is old. It's been stored wrong. The contacts are corroded. The save battery is dying. The TV is messing with the colors. But my notebook didn't care about those explanations. It just kept collecting evidence. And slowly, my life started to behave like the game. Not in big, dramatic ways, in small, sharp failures. I forgot where I put my pencil, even though it was in my hand. I stood in the hallway staring at the coat closet, trying to remember what you call the thing you hang coats on. I looked at a friend at lunch, Kim, a girl I'd known since second grade, and for a full second, I couldn't pull her name forward. The syllable snagged like fabric on a nail. I covered it by talking around it. Hey, instead of Kim. That teacher, instead of Mrs. Warren. Over there, instead of Maple Street. It wasn't one blank. It was dozens, each one small enough to ignore until they started stacking. The notebook became a battleground. I started writing non-game things in the margins, almost as a dare. Dad's full name, our address, Mom's work number, Kim's phone number, Mrs. Warren's first name, Denise, the route home, left at the deli with the cat in the window, right at the house with blue shutters, straight until you can smell the bakery. I didn't tell myself I was doing it just in case. I didn't say that phrase in my head. I only did it. A quiet instinct, like putting a hand on the wall in the dark. The next afternoon, half the margin was blank. No torn paper, no smudges, no eraser crumbs. Just gone. If I held the page up to the lamp, I could see the pressure marks, faint grooves where my pencil had pressed, the shape of my own letters without the graphite. Proof something had been there. My handwriting emptied out. The worst part was that I didn't always notice right away. Sometimes I'd flip through the notebook and see a smooth white margin and feel a strange pause in my body, like stepping into a room and forgetting why you walked in. Then I'd tilt the page and see the ghost letters hiding in the light, and I'd know. The hallway happened on a night the air felt thick. It was late. The apartment was quiet except for the refrigerator and the tiny tick of the kitchen clock. I woke up needing the bathroom and pushed my door open into the narrow hall where all the doors lined up like teeth. There was a nightlight plugged in near the bathroom. It cast a soft puddle of light and left the rest in shadow. The VCR clock glowed 12:07 in blue. Dad's silhouette moved down the hall ahead of me, tall, slightly hunched from a long day, one shoulder higher than the other from an old injury. The outline was familiar enough that my body recognized it before my brain did. "Hey," I whispered so I wouldn't startle him. He didn't answer. He kept walking. "Dad?" I tried again, a little louder. He stopped near the bathroom door and turned his head, just a fraction. The nightlight was behind him. His face stayed in shadow, and at that moment, standing in the dark with the carpet cool under my feet, I realized I couldn't picture his face. Not "I'm tired" fuzzy, not the normal blur of low light. It was as if the details simply refused to load. Glasses, brown eyes, a mouth that smiled more on one side. I knew these facts the way you know the rules of a game, but when I tried to assemble them into an image, there was nothing. No living picture. like trying to recall a photo that never finished downloading. Dad spoke, and the sound anchored the shape. "You okay, kiddo?" His voice arrived clean and whole. The image did not. I swallowed. My mouth felt dry. "Bathroom." "'Kay." He patted the door frame on his way back past me. "Don't forget to turn off the light." His hand brushed my shoulder as he passed. Warm. Real. That small physical confirmation made my shoulders unlock. In the morning, I told myself it had been dark. That's all. That's enough. Move on. At school, later, when Mrs. Warren called on me, my throat tightened and I stared at my worksheet as if the answer was written there. "Claire," she said. I opened my mouth and realized I couldn't summon her name, not her last name, not her first, just Mrs., and then a blank line. "Sorry," I said. I forgot what I was going to say." A couple kids snickered. Someone tapped a pencil. The classroom smelled like warm markers and stale cafeteria air. Mrs. Warren, Denise, according to my notebook, tilted her head. "Are you feeling okay today?" "Yeah," I said, too quickly. But when I got home, Dad watched me take my shoes off in the entryway like he was counting seconds. Mom was in the kitchen with a grocery list. "How was school?" "Fine," I said. Dad didn't look away. "You've been blanking a lot lately." Mom glanced up. "Blanking?" "Words," Dad said. "Names." Mom's eyebrows lifted. "Middle school is a lot. You're probably tired." "It's not just tired," Dad said, and his tone was still calm, but there was a line under it, like a pencil pressed too hard. "She got turned around last week walking to Kim's." "She's 11, Mom said. 11-year-olds get turned around." Dad didn't argue. He just looked at me. "How often is it happening?" I shrugged, because numbers felt like admitting something. That night, he lingered at the kitchen table while I did homework. Not hovering, not dramatic, just present. His mug of coffee in his hands, his eyes drifting to my notebook when I flipped pages. I could feel him noticing the way I hesitated before writing certain words, like I was checking if they were still there. The day I forgot how to get home was warm, bright, and ordinary, which made it worse. The final bell rang, and I left school with my backpack bouncing against my spine. The sidewalk shimmered a little in heat. Kids yelled across the street. Someone's radio played through an open car window. I walked a route I'd walked 100 times. Left past the deli with the cat in the window. Right at the house with blue shutters. Straight until you can smell the bakery. Except when I reached the corner by the blue shutters, the world flattened. The street in front of me looked familiar. Trees, mailboxes, cracked pavement. But it didn't connect to anything. Like a map with the label scraped off. I stood there with my backpack straps tight in my fists, waiting for the route to show up the way it always did. It didn't. I turned in a slow circle. Every direction looked like it could be correct, and like it could lead somewhere completely wrong. The corners of my vision felt too bright. My tongue stuck to the roof of my mouth. A car passed. Someone laughed across the street. Normal life kept moving around me like I was a piece of furniture left in the wrong place. I walked 2 blocks in what I thought was the right direction and ended up in front of Mrs. Singer's house. Mrs. Singer was an older woman who always had a cat in her window and wind chimes on her porch. She looked surprised to see me. "Claire?" she said. "Honey, What are you doing here? My voice came out thin. Can I call my dad? Sure. She didn't ask questions. She just opened the door wider and let me in. Her house smelled like lemon cleaner and something sweet baking. I called home. Mom answered first. I heard Dad's voice in the background before he picked up. "Where are you?" he asked. "At Mrs. Singer's," I said. A pause. "Okay, stay there. I'm coming." When he pulled up, he got out of the car fast, not running, but moving with purpose. His face held itself tight, like he was trying to stay calm on the outside so I could borrow it. He didn't scold me. He didn't ask why. He just put a hand on the back of my head, steady and warm. "It's okay," he said, quiet. "You're okay." At home, Mom met us at the door. "Turned wrong?" she repeated, and her voice wasn't sharp, but it wasn't casual either. "I don't know why," I said. "It just didn't look familiar." Mom and Dad exchanged a look over my head. This time, neither of them shrugged. The next week, they took me to a doctor. The office smelled like antiseptic and old carpet. The waiting room had outdated magazines with celebrities I didn't recognize, and a fish tank that made a bubbling sound like a tiny machine breathing. Dad filled out forms carefully, printing each letter like it mattered. Mom sat beside him with her purse in her lap, tapping one fingernail against the clasp in a quick, even rhythm she probably didn't know she was making. When the nurse called my name, Dad stood up immediately. They shined a light in my eyes, asked me the date, had me repeat 3 words, apple, chair, penny, and say them again 5 minutes later while the doctor talked to my parents in a low voice. I got them right. They asked me to draw a clock. They asked me to count backward. They asked me to remember a short list and repeat it. I did. The doctor's smile stayed professional. "She's doing well on these," she said, like that settled something. Dad asked, "So what's causing the blanks?" The doctor tilted her head. "Sometimes stress presents like this. Growth, hormones, adolescence does strange things to cognition." Mom exhaled, like she'd been waiting for those words. "So, nothing serious." "Nothing alarming," the doctor said. They sent me for imaging, just to be thorough. I lay inside a machine that hummed in mechanical pulses, the sound like a distant helicopter made of metal. The room was cold. The table beneath me was hard. I stared at a sticker on the wall and tried to keep my hands still. Afterward, the doctor flipped through the images on a lit screen. "Everything looks normal," she said. "No structural abnormalities." Dad leaned closer to the screen like he could see the blanks hiding between pixels. "So it's what? Stress?" The doctor's smile didn't change. "That would be my first thought." The answers were tidy. They didn't explain my notebook's pressure marks. They didn't explain the click on the star map. They didn't explain why, that night, when I opened my notebook to show Dad the route home we'd drawn together, the words Maple Street were missing from the page, leaving only the groove of my own handwriting, like a track in soft earth. Dad ran his thumb over the indentation. His mouth tightened. Mom said, "Maybe she erased it." Dad didn't look up. "There's no residue or ghosting." Mom's jaw set. "Paper smudges." Dad finally met her eyes. "Look at it." Mom tilted the page under the kitchen light. Her face changed, just slightly, as the indent caught the angle. Neither of them said anything after that. I didn't play Starflight for 3 days. The Genesis sat under the TV, with the cartridge still in it, the red power light dark. My notebook stayed closed on the coffee table, like it could hear me thinking about it. I avoided it the way you avoid making eye contact with someone you owe something to. The problem with avoidance is that it leaves you alone with the question, and the question kept tapping on the inside of my skull like a cursor at the edge of a blank grid. On the fourth night, Dad worked late. Mom fell asleep on the couch with a book open on her chest. The living room was dim, the TV reflecting the kitchen light like a pane of black glass. I sat on the carpet with the controller in my lap and my notebook open. The shaded void box stared back at me from the page. T9. I told myself I was going to prove it was nothing, that if I could make the star come back, everything else would settle. I turned the Genesis on. The starfield appeared. The title music tried to be brave and futuristic. Menus slid open. My hands felt too warm around the controller. I navigated to the quadrant where T9 lived. The grid in that corner looked faint, like it had been drawn with a tired pencil. The background stars were sparse. I moved the cursor over the square. No chirp, just that little dead click. For a second, nothing happened. The game stayed itself. The universe stayed indifferent. Then the ship's status window flickered, as if someone had tapped the side of the TV. The text in the lower portion of the screen, normally filled with bland messages about fuel consumption or scanner sweeps, went black. White characters began to appear, one by one, as if being typed by an invisible hand. Not the game's normal font, slightly different, slightly too clean. The screen displayed 2 lines. To navigate, record what you cannot afford to lose. I stared at the sentence until the letters felt like they were pressing into my eyes. Starflight didn't talk like that. Its messages were dry, functional. Fuel warnings, scan results, landing reports. This looked like advice. No, worse, it looked like a rule. My notebook lay open beside me. My pencil hovered above the paper. I didn't want to write it down, but my hand twitched between those impulses like a needle between magnets. The message blinked once, and for a fraction of a second, I thought I saw another line underneath, half-formed. A list. A menu. Coordinates. Cargo. Crew. Memory. It vanished before I could be sure. The status window cleared, returning to its usual scroll of meaningless ship updates. The grid corner brightened. The square that had been empty flickered. T9 returned as a tiny star. I felt my whole body lean forward without permission, like my brain had lunged. Then the click sounded again, soft and satisfied, and the star vanished. Gone. Back to the blank square. Not erased, unrendered. I looked down at my notebook, and my pencil was already moving, writing the message in block letters, hard enough that the paper bowed slightly under the pressure. When I finished, I blinked, and the words I'd just written were already fading. Not smudging, not rubbing off. Fading, like ink left in sunlight. By the time I tilted the page toward the lamp, the message was gone, leaving only the impression of letters pressed into the fibers. A scar of my own handwriting. I dropped the pencil. The controller sat in my lap, warm and stupid. The TV hummed. Mom shifted on the couch, asleep with a book in her lap. I sat there with the notebook open to a page of dents, looking from the blank square on the grid to the pressure marks in the paper and back again. Whatever rule the game had been teaching me, I finally understood one part of it. It wasn't enough to find something. You had to keep it. and suddenly I wasn't sure which side of that exchange I was on. Recovery didn't come from figuring the system out. It came from stepping away from it. I didn't turn the Genesis off right away. I just sat, staring at the blank square on the grid, the notebook open beside me. When Dad came home, he found me like that. He didn't ask why I was up. He didn't tease me for falling asleep on the carpet. He saw my posture, the way the notebook lay open, and he lowered himself onto the couch carefully, like sudden movements might break something. "What happened?" he asked. I didn't give him a neat explanation. I couldn't. So I showed him. I turned the notebook toward him and tilted it under the lamp until the marks caught the light. Words without shape. My handwriting without graphite. Dad leaned in, his face tightening. Mom woke to the sound of the lamp chain and sat up, hair flattened on one side. "What's going on?" Dad didn't answer her at first. He looked at the page, then looked at the TV, still on the nav screen, the cursor hovering over a blank square. I tried to speak and only got air. I swallowed and tried again. "It wrote something," I said. "In the game." Mom blinked hard, waking up fully. "What do you mean it wrote something?" Dad's voice stayed low. "Tell her." So I told them about T9, about the click, about the message. I didn't say, "It's eating my memory." I didn't need to. Dad's eyes flicked to me, then to the notebook, then to the place on the screen where the star should have been. Mom's face held itself steady in the way adults do when they want to stay in charge of a situation. "That's not possible," she said. "I know," I replied, and my voice cracked on the word. Dad stood up. He walked to the TV and turned the power off with one smooth motion. The screen collapsed into a bright dot and then darkness. The room suddenly felt quieter, like the house itself had been holding its breath along with the machine. He popped the cartridge out of the Genesis and held it in his hand for a long moment. Mom watched him. "What are you going to do with it?" Dad looked at her. "I think we should get rid of it. Do you disagree?" Mom's mouth opened, then closed. She glanced at me, at the notebook, at the lamplight catching the dents in the paper. "No," she said quietly. "I don't." Dad turned to me. "You sure?" The question landed heavy, because the truth was, I wanted to say no. I wanted to say I'd built a whole galaxy. I had roots and profits and secrets. I had a crew. I had something that made me feel competent in a world where most of my competence was limited to homework and chores. But I also had blank squares in my own head. I looked at the notebook page, at the place where memory had once been written in graphite and then removed cleanly, leaving only the groove. For 1 second, I wanted to grab it back. Not because I didn't believe, because I did. Because some part of me still wanted the map finished. I nodded. "I'm sure." Dad walked to the kitchen trash and dropped the cartridge in. It hit the bottom with a hollow plastic clack that echoed louder in my chest than in the room. Mom flinched at the sound, like she hadn't expected it to sound so heavy. Dad tied the bag and carried it out to the dumpster before he went to bed. After that, most things stabilized. Not instantly, not perfectly, but the world stopped shedding pieces as quickly. Dad started walking me home when he could, not because he said I couldn't do it, but because he needed the steps. On days he couldn't, we sat at the kitchen table and redrew my route on paper, block by block, "What's here?" he'd ask, tapping a corner. "The deli with the cat," I'd answer. "Mrs. Singer's porch. The maple tree with those helicopter seeds." Mom joined sometimes, adding details like street names and landmarks, insisting on practicality. She made copies of the map and placed one inside my backpack like I was going on a field trip. She never said she believed me, but she made 3 copies. I didn't complain. I let her. I kept a different notebook after that, one that wasn't a star chart. Plain, unadorned. I wrote down names and faces and small details, not because I wanted to hoard them, but because it felt like rebuilding a coastline after a storm. They stayed. The old notebook, the Starflight one, still held scars. When I flipped through it, whole margins were blank except for the pressure marks of erased life. My handwriting without shape. My younger self's insistence without proof. Sometimes, in certain light, I could make out the indent of my address, my teacher's name, my dad's face, described in a way that made my throat go tight. Those grooves never filled back in. The paper remembered the act of writing, even when the graphite didn't. The empty star system never came back either. T9 stayed blank in my mind, like a joke I couldn't finish. Years passed. Middle school turned into high school. I grew into someone organized, responsible, detail-oriented. I learned how to carry calendars and lists without making it look like a survival tactic. I learned how to smile when I checked my keys twice before locking the door. I built my life around redundancy. Paper backups for digital things, notes for phone calls, address written in my wallet even when everyone else trusted their brain. Most of the time, it worked, but the void blinks never fully stopped. They were rare, quick, 3 seconds where a familiar route felt like it had no labels. A moment where a face in a crowd refused to assemble into a person I recognized. It always snapped back. Still, those seconds left a residue. A lingering awareness that reality could flatten, that edges could blur, that the world could fail to render for a heartbeat. I didn't tell people about it. I didn't have a name for it that wouldn't sound absurd. I carried a notebook, always. I told them the whole story years later, in a different apartment, with coffee on the table and Dad wearing reading glasses low on his nose. He listened without interrupting. Mom did too, though I could see her mouth set the way it always did when a thing had no sensible drawer to fit into. When I finished, Dad nodded once and said very quietly, "That's why you started writing my face down." I hadn't realized until then that some part of him had been carrying that question all along. Mom said, "We took you to the doctor." Not arguing, just placing the old fact where she thought it belonged. Dad looked at me over the rim of his mug. "I'm glad we threw it out," he said. So was I. He died last year. It was not unexpected, but it was earlier than anticipated. A heart issue that had been lurking politely in the background and then decided to step forward. At the funeral, the world had that strange brightness that sometimes comes with grief. The air smelled like flowers. People spoke softly, in the way people do in rooms where the sound feels intrusive. Mom sat beside me, fingers laced in her lap. On an easel near the front was a framed photo of Dad at my middle school graduation, smiling under a suit jacket that didn't fit quite right. Glasses, crooked smile on the left side, those lines between his eyebrows even when he was trying to look cheerful. I stared at the photo and tried to hold it in place inside me, like pinning a map to a wall. Then the void blink hit. For a heartbeat, the face in the frame flattened. The details slipped. The features refused to assemble. Not because of tears. Not because I was too far away. It was like my brain reached for the file and found a blank space where it should have been. My throat tightened. My hands went cold around the tissue I'd been holding. Mom squeezed my hand, mistaking my stillness for the normal shock of loss. Maybe it was. Maybe it wasn't. I closed my eyes once, just long enough to find my balance. And my mind, unhelpful and precise, offered the old sentence like a caption. To navigate, record what you cannot afford to lose. I didn't want it. It arrived anyway. I opened my purse. There was a notebook inside. Of course there was. There has always been a notebook. This one was small and worn, the elastic band frayed, the pages softened at the corners. I flipped toward the back where old entries lived like pressed leaves. And there it was, in my early teen handwriting. Dad, long face, crooked smile on the left side, lines between eyebrows when thinking, glasses always smudged, laughs in short huffs, then longer one he tries to hide. The ink was faded. The paper was creased as if I'd folded it once and then decided not to. Underneath, if I tilted it toward the stained glass window light, there were faint pressure marks from an even older entry. Something I'd written hard enough to leave scars. I traced the indent with my fingertip. Then I looked up again. Dad's face came back. Glasses, smile, lines, whole. I sat there with the notebook open on my lap, my thumb resting on the old indents, and I let the service continue around me. Afterward, at home, I put the notebook on my kitchen table and sat with it longer than intended. Some things had come back clean. His face in the graduation photo, the line between his eyebrows, the crooked pull of his smile. Other details still stood just out of reach. Not gone, just not willing to come forward when called. Before bed, I tilted the page toward the lamp again, more from habit than hope. The pressure marks caught the light, and beneath the entry about Dad's face, I saw another line of indent I didn't remember making. 2 words, pressed hard. No graphite. I could read them only because I knew my own handwriting. Home. Found. I shut the notebook gently, but the notebook clasp did not quite latch.
A doctor's office is a bright place for a story like this. The kind of brightness that insists there is always a name for what is happening, a test, a scan, an image you can point to and say, there, that's the thing. Claire's images showed nothing concerning, no obvious damage, no clear cause. Officially, the world stayed intact, and yet she lived through a stretch of time when certain details refused to hold. Graphite vanished, pressure remained. A child's careful notes became the only proof that something had been there at all. You can hear it in the shape of her recovery. It wasn't a cure. It wasn't a victory hidden somewhere deeper in the game. It was a decision. A family deciding that whatever the cartridge offered was not worth what it seemed to ask in return. That choice gave most of it back. Most. Because there is usually one square that isn't there. One coordinate that stays blank no matter how often you return to it. One face that takes an extra second to assemble. One detail that never quite comes home.
Claire keeps notebooks now. Some people would call that organization. Some would call it habit. I think she learned a rule and never fully unlearned it. Record what you cannot afford to lose. The cartridge is gone. The galaxy it offered her is gone with it. But some instructions survive the hardware that taught them. And the oldest ones are not always the ones written in ink or graphite.